Before the story begins, if you've ever felt undervalued because of your appearance, if you've ever been glanced at in a room full of power, or if you've ever remained silent, not because you were weak, but because you knew you were stronger, please take a moment to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because today's story isn't just for listening, it's for feeling, and perhaps for remembering for a long time. Aurora Air Group's Boeing 787 taxied slowly down the runway at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. Outside, the late autumn sky was a pale gray, a gentle breeze blowing, carrying just enough chill to make one pull up their collar. Inside the first-class cabin, everything was almost completely silent. Not the kind of uncomfortable silence. It's the kind of silence that's paid for with thousands of dollars. Cream-colored leather chairs, soft yellow lighting, the gentle clinking of crystal glasses against silver trays, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the subtle scent of sandalwood. In seat 2A by the window on the left, a black woman was sitting upright, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her name is Danielle Carter. She was in her early 30s. Not particularly striking. Not wearing heavy makeup. She wore a charcoal gray sweater, dark trousers, and black flats. No elaborate jewelry. Just a thin watch on her left wrist. At first glance, many would think she's some kind of mid-level professional who just got a last-minute promotion, or perhaps the assistant of someone very important. Danielle didn't care about the stares around her. She'd been used to it for a long time. She looked out the window where New York City was shrinking beneath a thin veil of clouds. For that brief moment, she took a deep breath. Slowly. Very slowly. It wasn't because she was nervous. It was because she was reminding herself of something familiar. Always stay calm. True power doesn't need to speak. A few seats away, other passengers were preoccupied with their own worlds. A middle-aged man was reading the Wall Street Journal, turning the pages very quietly. An elderly couple was whispering about the weather in San Francisco. Another person had headphones on, their eyes closed as if they didn't want to exist in this airplane cabin. No one paid attention to Danielle. And she didn't need to, until he showed up. Heavy footsteps echoed from the entrance to the first-class cabin. No hurry, no hesitation. Each step carried a sense of possession. That man's name is Howard Blake. Around 55 years old, fair skin, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, a shiny heavy metal watch. He dragged his suitcase behind him, his eyes scanning each seat as if inspecting his territory. Howard Blake was the kind of person who was used to being given way. Used to people standing up when he entered a room. Used to his voice ending every argument. He stopped at seat number 2. He looked down at the ticket. He looked up. Then his gaze froze. Seat 2B, and next to him is Danielle. 1 second. 2 seconds. There was no immediate response. Just a very slight frown, an almost unconscious tightening of the jaw. Howard turned to the flight attendant standing nearby. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, clear, and so polite it was hard to find fault with him. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." The flight attendant, Emily Harris, smiled professionally. "No, sir. Your seat is 2B." Howard tilted his head, his gaze still fixed on Danielle as if she were an out-of-place object. "I understand," he said slowly, "but I usually fly this route. And first class used to be different." Emily paused for a moment. "What do you mean?" Howard didn't answer immediately. He looked at Danielle again, this time for longer. Danielle felt that gaze. She had felt that kind of gaze her whole life. She didn't turn. She didn't react. She didn't change her posture. "Just tighten your grip a little." Howard exhaled through his nose. "She doesn't belong here." The words were not loud, not harsh, not directly offensive. But the whole cabin seemed to sag. Emily stood still. A few passengers looked up. Someone stopped flipping through a newspaper. Danielle continued to look out the window, silent. A profound silence. Like the moment before a clap of thunder, Howard continued, his voice still even. "Perhaps we should double-check the list. I pay for privacy. To a certain standard." Emily swallowed hard. "Sir, she has a valid ticket." Howard chuckled faintly. "Some people always have valid tickets, don't they?" Danielle closed her eyes for a very brief second. Old memories flashed through her mind. Meeting rooms where she was asked, "Whose assistant are you?" Presentations interrupted. Times when she had to prove herself twice as hard just to be recognized half as good. She opened her eyes. He still didn't turn around. "It's not because she's afraid. It's because she's making a choice. Choose the time." Outside, the aircraft engines began to hum. A loudspeaker announced that the plane was preparing for takeoff. And in that first-class cabin, no one knew that. In just a few hours, the entire power structure they were familiar with would be completely overturned. What about you? If you were Danielle, would you speak up right now? Or continue to remain silent? Stay here. The story has only just begun. The plane began to taxi more slowly, then came to a stop in the takeoff queue. The engines roared softly and steadily like a giant heartbeat, preparing to accelerate. In the first-class cabin, the lighting was dimmed. A few passengers pulled thin blankets over their laps. The occasional soft click of seatbelts could be heard. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but beneath that calm exterior, a tense current was silently coursing through each seat. Danielle Carter is still seated in seat 2A. She didn't lower her head. She didn't flinch. She didn't pretend not to hear. She simply kept her back straight, her gaze fixed on the window where the gray sky was gradually expanding. In that moment, Danielle let her mind wander, not to escape reality but to keep herself from reacting instinctively. She is very familiar with this type of situation. No fuss, no rudeness from the start. Instead, begin with polite remarks, so polite that if you react, you'll be seen as overly sensitive. "She doesn't belong here." That saying isn't new. It's just wrapped in a more sophisticated form. Danielle had heard it in many different forms over the past 20 years. Howard Blake sat down in seat 2B. He neatly placed his briefcase under the seat in front of him, adjusted his tie, and leaned back in his chair, as if this were where he had always belonged. But his eyes never left Danielle. It wasn't a curious gaze, not one of inquisitiveness. Rather, it was the gaze of someone trying to understand why their familiar order had been disrupted. Howard pressed the button to call the flight attendant. Ding. The sound was low but clear. Emily Harris appeared almost immediately. Her smile remained, but her eyes showed a hint of tension. "Sir, how can I help you?" Howard lowered his voice, just loud enough so that no one could tell he was causing trouble. "I just wanted to confirm," he said, "the airline's seating arrangement policy. I've been flying with Aurora Air Group for over 10 years. I know first class is usually different." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Sir, all the passengers in this compartment have valid tickets." Howard smiled very faintly, a smile that was not at all happy. "Yes, I have no doubt about that," he said, "but sometimes the system makes mistakes. Or there are exceptional cases." Emily felt her palms were slightly sweaty. She understood perfectly well the exceptional circumstances that Howard Blake was referring to. And she also understood that if she handled it incorrectly, she would be the one to bear the consequences. Danielle remained silent. She heard it all. Every single word. She heard Howard's soft sigh. She heard the hesitation in Emily's voice. She heard the silence of those around her. No one spoke up. No one is saying this is wrong. Danielle suddenly realized something very familiar. Howard Blake wasn't the only one saying she didn't belong here. The silence throughout the entire cabin also said it all. The plane began to accelerate. A gentle push pressed Danielle's back against the seat. New York slid downwards. The moment the plane's wheels left the ground, Danielle closed her eyes. It wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she was wondering. When should I speak up, and do I even need to speak up? She knew that if she spoke up now, it would become a big deal. She would be seen as someone who was making a fuss. She would be labeled as unpleasant. And Howard Blake, he will still be the one in power in this room. Danielle opened her eyes. She looked down at the small leather bag under the seat. Inside were a laptop, some documents, and her phone, which was vibrating very softly. She didn't take it out. Not yet. Once the plane reaches a stable altitude, the seatbelt sign turns off. The sounds in the cabin become a little more lively. Emily returned with the drinks cart. What would you like to order? One person ordered champagne. Another ordered soda. Emily turned to Howard first. Whiskey. Neat, he said quickly. Then he turned to Danielle. What would you like? Emily asked, her voice softer. Danielle turned her head for the first time since Howard boarded the plane. She looked at Emily, not at Howard. Water, no ice. Thank you. Her voice was calm. There was no defiance, no defensiveness. Howard raised his eyebrows slightly. He looked Danielle up and down as if trying to find something that didn't match. When Emily left, Howard leaned back slightly. Do you fly this route often? He asked. Danielle didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window for another second. Then she turned away. Not often, she said, but enough to know I'm in the right place. His voice was neither high nor low, not cold, just certain. Howard chuckled softly. First class used to be where people worked their whole lives to get it. Danielle nodded slightly. I agree. Howard waited, but Danielle said nothing more. The atmosphere between the two of them froze. Howard was unaccustomed to having his power circuit interrupted like this. He was used to having others explain, justify, and prove things. Danielle did nothing, and that's what annoyed Howard. In the back, an elderly passenger let out a soft sigh. Another person glanced at their phone as if trying to escape the moment. Nobody wants to get involved. Nobody wants to take sides. Danielle realized that, and she had a very strange feeling inside. Not sad, not angry, but it's obvious. It's clear how this society works. It's clear why it took her so many years to learn how to be silent at the right time. She placed her hand on the armrest. Her fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed. Not now, she told herself. Let them tell us everything themselves. The plane continued its westward flight, and in that first-class cabin the tension simmered, waiting for a moment of explosion. The plane had stabilized at cruising altitude. The sky outside turned a pale blue, stretching endlessly into the distance. In the first-class cabin, everyone had gradually retreated back into their own world. Or at least that's what they pretended to be. But between seats 2A and 2B, the atmosphere remained as tense as a rope stretched beyond its limit. Howard Blake took a sip of whiskey. He held the glass very firmly, as if clinging to something familiar. Control. Superiority. The feeling of still being above. He glanced at Danielle Carter. She was opening her laptop. The screen lit up, casting a soft reflection on her calm face. No social media. No movies. Just lines of text, data tables, and a chart paused on an unfinished page. Howard frowned. It wasn't out of curiosity about the content. Rather, it was because he felt uneasy seeing someone he considered not belonging here behaving so freely. What do you work in? Howard asked. The question sounds harmless, but the tone is anything but. Danielle typed a few more lines, then stopped. She closed her laptop very slowly. She placed it neatly on the tray. She turned to look at Howard. I work in the investment field, she said. Howard raised an eyebrow. Really? Danielle nodded. Yes. A brief silence. Howard chuckled softly. Investing is a rather broad field. Danielle didn't deny it. Yes. Howard swirled the whiskey glass in his hand. The ice clinked against the sides of the glass, a sound louder than necessary. I'm just curious, he continued, because usually the people sitting here have very specific reasons. Danielle looked at him. Her gaze was flat, not challenging. It's just the gaze of someone who's listening but refuses to be judged. I have my reasons too, she said. Howard laughed. This time the laugh lacked its initial politeness. You don't need to be so defensive, he said. It's just. First class used to be for those who had built something truly significant. Danielle tilted her head very slightly. How do you define really? She asked. Howard paused slightly. Clearly he wasn't used to being questioned in this way. I'm talking about experience, he replied. About time. About having been in the industry long enough. Danielle nodded. I understand. Howard waited. He waited for an explanation. He waited for a story to prove her point. He waited for her to say more to prove herself worthy. Danielle did nothing. She just turned to look out the window. This silence is not avoidance. It's like not participating in a game where you know you don't need to win. Howard sensed that, and it irritated him more than any rebuttal. In the aisle, Emily Harris was clearing away trays of drinks. She could sense the tension. She didn't need to hear every word clearly, just by looking at their eyes, their gestures, and the distance between them. She had been a flight attendant for 12 years. She knew when a situation was about to spiral out of control. Emily stopped near seat number 2. Sir, she said softly, we will be serving your meal in about 20 minutes. Howard didn't look at her. He kept looking at Danielle. You know, he continued, there are some things you can't get into just with money. Danielle turned to Emily. Thank you, she said to the flight attendant. Then she turned back to look at Howard. You're right, she replied. There are some things that money can't buy. Howard smirked. For example, Danielle thought for a second. Character, she said. The words were spoken softly, without emphasis. But it fell into the aircraft's cabin like a small stone thrown into calm water. Howard clenched his jaw. His eyes darkened. What are you implying? He asked. Danielle kept her gaze fixed. Nothing. I just agree with you. Howard laughed louder. This time, a few passengers turned to look. It's interesting, he said, to hear a moral lesson from someone whose experience I don't even know is worthy of sitting here. The atmosphere felt frozen. Emily stood a few steps away. She felt her heart beating faster. Danielle took a deep breath. In that moment, an image of herself from years ago flashed through her mind. A younger Danielle standing in a cold conference room, being asked by an older man, "Are you sure you understand these numbers?" She remembered the feeling then, the feeling of wanting to prove something, wanting to explain, wanting to be recognized. She opened her eyes. The Danielle of today is no longer the same. You don't need to know my experience, she said slowly. Just as I don't need you to confirm why I'm here. Howard leaned towards her. The distance between the two seats seemed to shorten. Do you know who I am? He asked. Danielle looked at him. No, she replied. And that doesn't change anything. A few soft gasps could be heard in the compartment. Howard leaned back in his chair. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. This world operates on the principle of knowing who you're talking to, he said. You'll learn that. Danielle nodded. I've been learning this for a long time. Howard shook his head as if he had just heard something very naive. You still have a lot to learn, he said, then turned away. The airplane cabin fell silent. The silence was heavier than before. Danielle returned to her laptop, but this time her fingers paused on the keyboard. It wasn't because she was distracted, it was because she knew. This confrontation is not over yet. It has only just begun to enter a new phase. A phase where politeness is no longer enough to conceal prejudice, and a phase where Howard Blake will begin to say what he has always thought but never had to face the consequences of. The plane continued to fly in silence, and at that altitude of over 30,000 feet, a thunderstorm was forming. After Howard Blake's final words, the first-class cabin fell into a strange state. No one said anything. No one looked anyone in the eye, but everyone heard it. The steady hum of the engine became the backdrop for an unnamed tension. Some passengers pretended to adjust their blankets. Others checked their phones even though there was no signal. This silence is not peace. It is collective avoidance. Danielle Carter sat upright, her shoulders relaxed. On the surface she was the same as before, but inwardly she was observing very closely. She watched Howard turn away his hand, still gripping the whiskey glass tightly. She watched Emily Harris slow her pace each time she passed row 2. She watched the people around her choose not to take sides. Danielle didn't blame them. She understood. Not everyone is safe enough to speak up. Not everyone is willing to pay the price for what is right. Howard turned around this time, not looking at Danielle. He spoke a little louder, as if talking to thin air. "It's a shame," he said, "that standards are being lowered so much just to please fashionable notions." A man in the front seat shifted slightly. An elderly woman frowned but said nothing. Danielle looked straight ahead. She knew what statements like these were designed for. Not to argue, to mark territory. Howard was telling everyone on the plane he was the one who belonged here, and she didn't. Emily returned with the trolley, this time carrying a hot towel. She stopped in front of Danielle first. "Would you like a napkin?" Emily asked. Danielle smiled very slightly. "Yes. Thank you." Emily handed her the towel. Their hands touched for a very brief moment. Emily looked at Danielle, her eyes conveying something apologetic, not for her actions but for what she couldn't do. Danielle nodded slightly as if to say, "I understand." When Emily turned to Howard, he refused the handkerchief. "I need to speak to the cabin manager," he said. "Not to complain, just to clarify a few things." Emily paused. "Sir, I can help. I want to speak to someone in a position of authority," Howard interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut short any other options. Emily took a deep breath. "Yes. I'll inform the captain." Danielle heard it. She didn't turn around. But she had a very familiar feeling in her heart. Things are about to go beyond the personal level. Howard Blake didn't just want to win a conversation. He wanted to eliminate it. 10 minutes later, Captain Michael Reynolds appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his face bearing the weariness of someone who had spent countless hours flying in his life. Captain Reynolds glanced around the cabin, then stopped at seat number 2. "Sir," he said to Howard, "I've been told there's a problem that needs solving." Howard stood up halfway, then sat back down. He adjusted his vest as if preparing for an important meeting. "Yes, Captain," Howard said. "I just wanted to say that I'm not comfortable with this seating arrangement." Captain Reynolds nodded. "Specifically," Howard tilted his head toward Danielle. "This is a long flight. I need space to work, and I don't think this is the right environment." Danielle turned to look at the captain for the first time since the start of the flight. Her gaze was calm. No pleading, no defensiveness. "Miss Carter," Captain Reynolds said, "do you have anything you'd like to share?" Danielle thought for a second. "I have a valid ticket," she said, "and I'm not bothering anyone." Howard chuckled softly. "That's not the problem," he said. "The problem is the context." Captain Reynolds sensed it. He'd heard enough complaints to know when a statement carried a deeper meaning. "Mr. Blake," he said slowly, "all passengers here are treated equally according to the airline's policy." Howard leaned back in his chair. "I understand policy," he said, "but experience can't be dictated by policy." A moment of silence fell. Captain Reynolds looked at Danielle. Then he looked at Howard. "He stands in the middle, between profit and fairness. Between a loud-mouthed customer and a silent passenger. Perhaps," Captain Reynolds said, "to maintain the comfort of the flight we could consider another option." Danielle looked at him. She knew where that sentence led. Howard knew that too, and he smiled. "For example," Howard asked. Captain Reynolds took a breath. "For example, Miss Carter could move to a different seat. We'll make adequate compensation." The airplane cabin held its breath. Danielle felt the gazes directed at her. Some were curious, some were expectant. Don't expect her to resist, expect her to yield. Danielle didn't answer immediately. She looked at Captain Reynolds, then she looked at Howard. In that moment, a very quiet struggle was taking place in her mind. If she agrees, everything will be over quickly. She'll be praised for being pleasant. No one will be embarrassed. But at that very moment she knew. She was about to reinforce an old familiar message, that her silence was consent, that her calmness was weakness. Danielle took a deep breath. She placed both hands on the armrests of the chair. Then she slowly stood up, not fast-paced, not dramatic, just enough for everyone in the compartment to realize she wasn't planning on retreating. Howard looked up at her, his eyes gleaming with something akin to an early victory. Captain Reynolds waited for an answer. Danielle looked straight at him. "I'm not moving," she said. Her voice was low, clear, not shaky. A few hushed whispers could be heard. Howard smirked. "You're making things more complicated than necessary," he said. Danielle turned to look at him. "No," she replied. "I'm just staying in my place." The air in the compartment was thick and heavy. Before Captain Reynolds could say anything more, Danielle spoke up. "But she said, I agree that we can't sit next to each other in this situation." Howard squinted. "Finally you understand," he said. Danielle looked straight at him. Her gaze was so calm that it made Howard uneasy. "No," she said, "the person who needs to move isn't me." Silence descended upon the airplane cabin. Deeper, heavier. And at that moment everyone understood that something very significant was about to be said. As Danielle Carter stood there in the middle of the first-class cabin, all eyes were on her. But in that moment Danielle could no longer see Howard Blake. She also couldn't see the captain or the passengers who were holding their breath in anticipation. She is looking at her own past. Danielle remembers vividly the first time she learned the value of silence. She was 23 years old, a recent MBA graduate walking into a Chicago boardroom in the cheapest suit she could afford. She was the only black person in the room, and the youngest. An older man looked her up and down and asked, "Are you an intern?" Danielle smiled and replied politely. She explained she provided her qualifications, achievements, and figures. And then she realized, the more she talked, the less they listened. Years later at another meeting, someone else interrupted her and said, "What do you mean? Just say it briefly." Danielle remained silent, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she understood that sometimes people don't want to hear the truth. They just want to maintain their familiar order. It was in those moments that Danielle learned something very important. Silence is not surrender. It is a strategy. Back in the airplane cabin, Danielle noticed her heartbeat had become surprisingly steady. No faster, no slower. She wasn't angry with Howard Blake. In fact, she hadn't been angry with people like him for a long time. Anger requires energy, and Danielle has learned to use her energy for things that are more valuable. She knew what Howard was thinking. He thought her silence was a sign of insecurity. He thought that with enough pressure she would give in, just like so many before her. But Howard didn't know. Danielle had sat in rooms where a decision could affect tens of thousands of people. She had signed documents that changed the course of entire corporations. She had heard far stronger opposition. Compared to all that, Howard Blake is just noise. Danielle looked at Captain Michael Reynolds. She saw hesitation in his eyes. Not because he didn't know what was right, but because he knew the price of doing the right thing in a system accustomed to compromise. Danielle understands that. She's been in that position before. She didn't want to turn him into an enemy. She just wanted him to see clearly. "I understand you're trying to maintain peace," Danielle said, her voice still low and even. "But peace cannot be built on one person leaving simply because another feels uncomfortable with their presence." Captain Reynolds swallowed nervously. Howard laughed contemptuously. "You're turning a personal matter into a social issue," he said. Danielle turned to look at him. "No," she replied. "He did that from the beginning." Howard was about to say something but then stopped, not because he was convinced, but because he wasn't used to being stared at like that. Danielle sensed a different gaze. She turned her head and saw Emily Harris standing a few steps away. Emily's gaze was no longer averted. It carries something very fragile, like hope. Danielle understood that look. She had once been Emily. She had once stood on the line between speaking out and keeping herself safe. Danielle nodded slightly at Emily. Not as a promise, but as reassurance. You are not alone. Howard exhaled heavily. What do you think you're doing? He asked. Who do you think you are? This question was so familiar that Danielle almost burst out laughing. She had heard it her whole life, from people who didn't want her in their room, from people who didn't want her sitting at their table, from people who didn't want her to exist in what they considered their own place. Danielle didn't answer immediately. She looked around the first-class cabin. Look at the people sitting there, people who are used to comfort, to being given preferential treatment, to not having to explain their presence. Danielle thought about this. How many of them have ever had to prove they deserve to sit there? She turned to look at Howard. I'm a passenger, she said. Just like you. Howard smirked. Don't pretend to be modest, he said. You know perfectly well you're different. Danielle nodded. Yes, I'm different. Howard looked up, thinking she had finally admitted what he suspected. Danielle continued. I'm different in that, she said, I don't need to make other people disappear to feel like I belong. That statement doesn't need emphasizing. It finds its place in the air on its own. A woman in the front seat let out a soft sigh as if she had been holding her breath for too long. Captain Reynolds looked at Danielle, then at Howard. He began to understand that this was no longer simply a matter of seating arrangements. It's about who is allowed to exist without asking permission. Danielle felt something very clear in her heart at that moment. She wasn't standing there just for herself. She was standing there for the times before when she'd had to sit down. For the times she'd left the room to keep the peace. For people like Emily standing there hoping someone safe enough would speak for them. She also knew, if she took this step, everything would change. There's no turning back. Danielle took a deep breath. Don't tremble. Don't rush. She was ready. Captain, she said, turning to look at Captain Reynolds, I will not move, and I do not need compensation. Howard shook his head and chuckled. You're very stubborn, he said. Danielle looked at him. No, she replied. I just don't bow my head anymore. The airplane cabin fell into a long silence. A moment of silence is no longer about avoidance. It's about waiting. And at that moment, everyone sensed that Danielle Carter wasn't just defending a seat. She was about to reveal a truth that no one in this compartment was ready to face. The first-class cabin had never been so quiet. It's not the kind of quiet that brings rest. It's the kind of silence that comes when someone knows a boundary has been crossed. Danielle Carter remained standing, her hands relaxed at her sides. She didn't take up space, nor did she step back. Her presence was just enough to make her impossible to ignore. Howard Blake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. He tried to appear calm, but the subtle tapping of his fingers on his sleeve betrayed him. This is unbelievable, Howard said, his voice slightly louder than before. We're delaying the entire flight because of one uncooperative person. Danielle didn't react. She stared straight ahead. Captain Michael Reynolds stood in the aisle, feeling the weight of every gaze directed at him. He's been flying for over 15 years. He's dealt with drunk passengers. He's faced in-flight emergencies. But moments like these are always the hardest. There are no checklists. There are no clear procedures. It's just people and power, Mr. Blake. Captain Reynolds said, his voice still calm. The flight is not delayed, and no one is being asked to leave their seat at this time. Howard laughed. So, you're telling me that my comfort is no longer important? Captain Reynolds looked at him. We strive to ensure the comfort of all passengers. Howard shook his head as if he had just heard something very naive. Do you know how long I've been flying with Aurora Air Group? He asked. I have an entire flight crew with me every month. I know people at the top, very high up. Some passengers began to shift. The atmosphere became heavier. Danielle turned to look at Captain Reynolds. "Captain," she said, her voice still, "if my sitting here violates any policy, you can show me." Captain Reynolds paused slightly. "No," he replied, "it doesn't violate anything." Danielle nodded. "Then this is no longer a policy issue," she said. "It's a matter of choice." Howard sat up halfway. "You're manipulating the situation," he said. "You're putting all of us in an awkward position." Danielle turned to look at him. "No," she said. "He did that the moment he said I didn't belong here." A brief silence fell. In the back seat, a middle-aged man cleared his throat softly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice slightly trembling. "I don't think anyone here did anything wrong." All eyes turned towards him. The man looked at Danielle. Then he looked at Howard. "She's just sitting in her seat," he continued. "Can we continue the flight?" An elderly woman nodded slightly. "Yes," she said. "There's no need to make things so complicated." Howard turned to look at them. His eyes turned cold. "It's interesting," he said, "when people are willing to speak up, but not to solve the problem." Danielle sensed it. The pressure was no longer just between her and Howard. It had spread throughout the cabin. Those who had been silent now began to speak. But they weren't speaking to defend her. They were speaking to get things back to normal. Danielle understands that feeling. The discomfort of someone disrupting a familiar rhythm, when injustice becomes more of an annoyance than a problem to be solved. She looked around. These faces aren't malicious, they just look tired. Danielle turned to look at Captain Reynolds. "Captain," she said, "I don't want to make this flight more difficult for anyone." Howard smirked, thinking she was about to give in. Danielle continued, "But I can't make it easy by disappearing either." Some people bowed their heads, as if that remark touched something very personal. Emily Harris stood at the back of the compartment, her hands clasped together. She looked at Danielle with a worried expression. Emily knew this could end in two ways. Either Danielle will be asked to leave, or Howard Blake will lose control. And neither is good. Howard breathed heavily. "I want to speak to the executive department," he said. "Right now." Captain Reynolds nodded. "I'll contact them." Danielle wasn't surprised. She had anticipated this move. Howard Blake was the kind of person who believed that if enough pressure was applied in the right places, the system would bend to his will. Captain Reynolds turned and walked towards the cockpit. "The first-class cabin is in a waiting state." Nobody said anything more. Danielle sat down in her chair. Not because she felt inferior, but because she no longer needed to stand. She has said enough. Howard sat back down, but his eyes remained fixed on her. "Do you know what will happen?" he asked, his voice low. "They'll choose the easiest way." Danielle looked at him. "Maybe," she said. "But the easy way isn't always the right way." Howard smirked. "You put too much faith in the system." Danielle shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "I believe in exposing the system." Howard didn't understand that statement. Not yet. A few minutes passed. Captain Reynolds returned. His face was more serious than before. "Mr. Blake," he said, "we've contacted the operations department. They're looking into the situation." Howard nodded, appearing satisfied. Danielle remained calm. She looked out the window. Outside, white clouds drift slowly by. The world at this altitude looks so peaceful. Danielle thought about that. How many injustices have occurred during this period of peace? She thought of those who would never be heard, those who were asked to leave for the sake of peace, those who had learned to shrink themselves so as not to cause trouble. Danielle gently squeezed the armrest of the chair. She knew, once the executive team responded, things would enter a different phase. It's no longer between two people. It's between an individual and an entire system. The airplane cabin remained silent, but this time it was the silence of waiting for the truth. Time seems to pass more slowly than usual in first class. No one looked at their watch, but everyone could feel each minute dragging on. Danielle Carter sat still in seat 2A, back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands resting lightly on the armrests. On the surface, she looked like a passenger waiting for her next meal. But inside, Danielle knew very well. Things had gone too far to go back to how they were. She was no longer caught in a personal dispute. She was facing a choice of principle. If she remains silent any longer, the system will automatically do what it always does. Choose the path of least trouble. Ask the less powerful person to step aside. And this story will repeat itself. As it has repeated thousands of times before, in places with no cameras, no witnesses, and no one to tell the story, Howard Blake broke the silence. "They'll handle it quickly," he said, his voice low but firm. "And then it will all be over." Danielle didn't turn around. She continued looking out the window. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. Howard chuckled softly. "I don't believe it," he said. "I know." Danielle nodded very slightly. She knew that feeling, the feeling of having lived long enough within a system to understand which way it would lean. "Have you ever wondered," Danielle said slowly, "why that system always chooses you?" Howard frowned. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Danielle turned to look at him. "It's not because you're right," she said. "It's because you're noisier." The statement wasn't an attack. It was more like a comment. Howard laughed even louder. "This world doesn't reward silence," he said. "It rewards those who know how to demand." Danielle didn't argue. She was only thinking of those who had never been taught how to ask for things. Those who had been taught to be grateful for being allowed in the room. Those who had been taught that if they drew attention, they would be a problem. Danielle used to be one of them. Captain Michael Reynolds returned to the first-class cabin. His footsteps were heavier than before. Not fast, not slow, just enough to signal that a decision is about to be made. Emily Harris stood at the back of the cabin, her hands clasped together. She looked at the captain, then at Danielle. Emily's gaze asked a question she didn't dare voice. "How will this story end?" Captain Reynolds stopped in the middle of the walkway. "Sir," he said, his voice clear, "thank you for your patience. We have spoken with operations." Howard sat up straight. Danielle remained motionless. "To ensure a comfortable flight," Captain Reynolds continued, "we propose a solution." Danielle knew this phrase. She had heard it in many different contexts throughout her life. Solution, compromise, harmony. Howard leaned forward. Finally, he said softly. Captain Reynolds looked at Danielle. "Miss Carter," he said, "we can arrange another seat for you in business class. We will refund the difference and give you a voucher." "Are not," Danielle interrupted him. "Don't raise your voice. Don't be harsh. But definitely." The airplane cabin felt frozen solid. Captain Reynolds blinked. "You don't agree?" Danielle stood up. "This time it's not about protest. It's about ending the ambiguity." "I disagree," she repeated. "Because that proposal doesn't solve the problem. It only shifts the problem elsewhere." Howard shook his head and gave a wry smile. "You're being unreasonable," he said. "You're being offered an honorable exit." Danielle turned to look at him. "Honor doesn't come from disappearing," she said. "It comes from standing still." Captain Reynolds took a deep breath. "Miss Carter," he said, "I understand your point of view, but I need to consider the entire flight." Danielle nodded. "And so do I," she said. "That's why I can't leave." A passenger in the seat in front spoke up. "Excuse me," the person said, their voice strained. Could we just continue the flight?" Danielle turned to look at the person. Her gaze softened. "I'd like that too," she said. "But that can only happen if no one is asked to disappear just to make others feel better." The airplane cabin fell silent again. It's no longer about avoidance. It's about confrontation. Captain Reynolds looked at Howard. Then he looked at Danielle. He knew that forcing Danielle to leave would be following precedent, but it would also confirm that the louder the voice, the better. "Mr. Blake," Captain Reynolds said, "we cannot force Miss Carter to leave her seat." Howard slammed his hand down on the armrest. "Then I will file a complaint," he said. "At the highest level." Danielle looked at him. "You have that right," she said, "just like I have the right to sit here." Howard jumped to his feet. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, his voice rising. "Do you think you can challenge this entire system?" Danielle looked straight at him. She didn't answer immediately. In that moment she thought of all the times she had chosen to remain silent. The times she had stepped aside. The times she had told herself that this wasn't worth making a big deal out of. She realized it was those very moments that taught the system that it could keep going. Danielle took a deep breath. "I'm not challenging the system," she said. "I'm asking it to live up to what it says it believes in." Howard smirked. "The system doesn't care what you believe," he said. "It cares who is more valuable." Danielle nodded. "You're right," she replied. "And that's why I'm still sitting here." Howard froze. There was something in Danielle's voice. It wasn't a challenge, nor was it a plea. It's like absolute certainty. Howard opened his mouth to say more but couldn't utter a word. The airplane cabin fell into a profound silence. A moment of silence where everyone sensed that a secret was about to be revealed. Danielle looked at Captain Reynolds. "Captain," she said, "if you want to know why I can't leave." She stopped. Everyone in the cabin held their breath. "I can explain." Howard looked at her, a hint of suspicion in his eyes. Danielle said nothing more. Not yet. But everyone understood that the answer that was about to come would change everything. The air in the first-class cabin became thick and heavy. No one is pretending to read the newspaper anymore. No one is pretending to sleep anymore. Everyone is waiting. Danielle Carter stood in the aisle, the soft yellow light falling on her shoulders. She wasn't taking up space. But no one could ignore her anymore. Howard Blake looked at Danielle with a mixture of discomfort and suspicion. He wasn't used to this feeling. The feeling when his power was no longer taken for granted. "An explanation," Howard repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I'd love to hear it." Captain Michael Reynolds stood tall. His professional instincts told him this moment was crucial, not just for the flight, but for how people would remember it. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice lower, "if you have anything to clarify, I'm listening." Danielle nodded. She wasn't in a hurry. She was never in a hurry in moments like this. "First of all," she said, her voice calm, "I want to make one thing clear." She looked around the compartment. "I'm not here to argue," she said, "nor to prove I'm worthy." Howard chuckled softly. "Then what are you doing standing here?" he asked. Danielle turned to look at him. "I'm standing here," she said, "because there are situations where silence would normalize wrongdoing." The airplane cabin was completely silent. Even the sound of the engine seemed further away. Danielle turned to look at Captain Reynolds. "The captain," she said, "asked me why I couldn't leave my seat." Captain Reynolds nodded. Danielle took a deep breath. "The reason," she said, "is because I'm not just a passenger." Howard raised an eyebrow. "Oh," he said, "another extraordinary story." Danielle didn't react. "I wasn't flying as a guest," she continued. "Not an upgrade, not a special treatment." She paused for a moment. "I fly as a responsible person." Captain Reynolds tilted his head slightly. "Responsible for?" he asked. Danielle looked straight at him. "For Aurora Air Group." A soft, faint gasp could be heard from somewhere in the compartment. Howard laughed even louder. "Are you kidding?" he asked. "Do you think you're a representative of the company?" Danielle shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't represent the company." She paused. "I run it." Silence descended upon the airplane cabin like a thick blanket. 1 second. 2 seconds. Captain Reynolds stood still. "Excuse me," he said slowly, "what do you mean?" Danielle opened the small leather bag under the seat. She didn't rummage through it. She took out a thin, neatly clipped folder of documents. She gave it to Captain Reynolds. "The deal was finalized this morning," she said. "My fund now holds a controlling stake in Aurora Air Group." Captain Reynolds took the document. He looked at the first page. Then he looked more closely. The color on his face changed very quickly. Howard Blake narrowed his eyes. "That's enough of this," he said. "You can't just—" Captain Reynolds raised his hand, signaling for silence. He continued reading. His lips pressed together. Then his eyes widened. He looked at Danielle. Then he looked back at the documents. "This signature," he muttered. Danielle nodded. "It's mine," she said. The airplane cabin was no longer silent. A few murmurs escaped. A woman whispered, "Oh my God." Someone behind her gasped. Howard Blake jumped to his feet. "Impossible," he said, his voice rising. "Do you think I'll believe that Captain Reynolds looked up?" "Mr. Blake," he said, his voice changing noticeably, "I need you to sit down." Howard looked at him. Then he looked at Danielle. "Are you saying you own this airline?" he asked. Danielle neither nodded nor denied it. "I said," she replied, "that I am responsible for the decisions made regarding it." Howard let out a dry laugh. "You're wearing a sweater," he said. "You've been sitting here for hours and nobody knows who you are. And now you tell me to believe that." Danielle looked straight at him. "You don't know who I am," she said, "because you never thought you needed to know." That statement hit the mark more effectively than any accusation. Captain Reynolds closed the file. He straightened up. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice now quite different from before, "I apologize for not informing you sooner." Danielle nodded. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I need clarity." Howard turned to look at Captain Reynolds. "Do you believe this?" he asked. Captain Reynolds looked at Howard. "Sir," he said, "I have verified the electronic signature, and the internal message has just been sent to the cockpit." Howard turned pale. "No," he whispered. Danielle looked at him. "You're right about one thing," she said softly. "The system cares about value." She stopped. "But value isn't always loud and clear." Howard took half a step back. His briefcase fell to the floor with a dry, clinking sound. No one laughed. No one cheered. The airplane cabin is not the place of victory. It is the place of truth. "Captain Reynolds Quay," sang Danielle. "How do you want us to handle this situation?" he asked. Danielle thought for a second. She looked around. "Look at Emily Harris standing silently at the back of the cabin. Look at the passengers who still didn't quite understand what was happening. Look at Howard Blake, who, for the first time all flight, was silent." "I don't want anyone to be humiliated," Danielle said. "And I don't want this flight to become a stage." Howard looked up, but Danielle continued, "I can't just let this slide as if it never happened either." She turned to Captain Reynolds. "Mr. Blake said I didn't belong here," she said. "And I think that's something that needs to be addressed." Howard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Danielle turned to look at him. "He once asked me who I thought I was," she said. "Now he has the answer." She stopped. "And you," she continued, "now it's your turn to ask why you think you have the right to decide who gets to stay where." The airplane cabin fell silent. A silence unlike anything before. No more avoidance. No more tension. All that remains is awareness. Danielle sat down in seat 2A. No victory, no celebration. It's simply about returning to your rightful place. And at that moment, everyone understood that things would never be the same again. The murmurs in the first-class cabin have died down. No one whispered. No one secretly filmed. No one dared to laugh. The truth has just been spoken. No more sound is needed. Danielle Carter sat back in seat 2A and buckled her seatbelt. The gesture was so ordinary that it became frightening. She didn't look around to gauge a reaction. She wasn't seeking validation. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She just sat down. And that's what caused the aircraft cabin to change. Howard Blake remained standing. He stood as if he hadn't yet grasped what had just happened. It was as if the ground had shifted, yet he still believed he was standing in the right place. "No," Howard said, his voice hoarse. "That's impossible." No one answered. Captain Michael Reynolds was the one who broke the silence. "Mr. Blake," he said, his voice low and firm, "I need you to sit down." Howard turned to him. "You can't take this seriously," he said. "Just because of a stack of papers." Captain Reynolds didn't raise his voice, but his tone changed completely. "This isn't just a stack of papers," he said. This is a structure of ownership. Howard looked at Captain Reynolds. Then he looked at Danielle. She planned this, he said, his voice trembling slightly. She sat there the whole flight letting me reveal myself. Danielle turned to look at him. No, she said, I'm just letting him be himself. That statement wasn't accusatory. It was more like an obvious truth. Howard shook his head. Do you think you've won? He asked. Do you think a few signatures can teach me a lesson? Danielle looked at him, her eyes not angry, just tired. I'm not here to teach you, she said. I'm here to protect those who can't protect themselves. Howard burst into loud laughter, but it was a broken, unjoyful laugh. You're speaking like an activist, he said, not a businesswoman. Danielle tilted her head. I'm an entrepreneur, she said. That's why I understand. Culture creates more long-term profits than fear. Captain Reynolds took a step forward. Miss Carter, he said, as the current head of operations at the company, how would you like us to handle this situation? The entire cabin held its breath once again. Howard turned sharply to Danielle. You can't do this, he said. You can't turn a flight into a courtroom. Danielle nodded. You're right, she replied. This isn't a trial. She paused for a moment. This is the consequence. Danielle Quay sang Captain Reynolds. First of all, she said, I want Mr. Blake to sit down. We don't need any more drama. Howard paused. Danielle looked at him. Sit down, she said softly. You've said enough. There was something about that voice that brooked no argument. Howard slowly sat down in seat 2B. No one helped him. No one looked at him with pity. He's just a man who has lost the privilege of being taken for granted, Danielle continued. Secondly, she said to Captain Reynolds, I want this whole thing to be documented. Howard looked up. Record it, he asked. What do you intend to do with it? Danielle didn't look at him. The recording is to prevent the system from pretending it didn't see anything, she said. Captain Reynolds nodded. We will prepare a full report, he said. Danielle Quay sang Emily Harris. Emily, she said, calling the flight attendant by her first name. Are you all right? Emily was taken aback. She hadn't expected that question. Yes, Emily replied, her voice trembling slightly. I'm fine, Danielle nodded. If you need to take notes on anything regarding behavior in the cabin, Danielle said, I want you to know that it is encouraged. Emily took a deep breath. For the first time during the flight, she stood straighter. Howard looked at the scene with a bewildered expression. What are you doing? He asked. You're turning everything upside down. Danielle turned to look at him. No, she said. I'm putting it back in the right place. Howard smirked. What do you think a report can change? He asked. I've seen hundreds of reports just sitting in drawers. Danielle nodded. Yes, she said. If no one is looking. She took out her phone. No rush. No fuss. She opened an internal application. The screen lit up. But things will be different, she said, when the person reading the report is me. Howard turned pale. She can't. Danielle looked up. He's on a flight, she said. Of an airline. She stopped. And I am responsible. That statement doesn't need emphasizing. Captain Reynolds straightened up even more. His voice became firm. Miss Carter, he said, we will follow your instructions. Howard turned to look at Captain Reynolds. You've chosen to side with her, he asked. Captain Reynolds looked at Howard. I choose to stand on the side of principles, he said. The airplane cabin fell silent. A silence unlike anything before. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of re-establishing order. Danielle put the phone down. She looked out the window. Outside, white clouds continue to drift by. The world remains as peaceful as ever, but inside this airplane cabin, everything has changed. Howard sat in silence. For the first time during the entire flight, he said nothing. Danielle didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She knew what was going on in his head. He was realizing that his power always existed because of the silence of others. And when that silence disappeared, what remained was just an ordinary human being. Captain Reynolds is preparing to return to the cockpit. Miss Carter, he said before leaving, if you need anything. Danielle shook her head. No, she said. I just need this flight to continue. Captain Reynolds nodded. Emily Harris began pushing the serving cart back. The meal would be served soon. Life on the flight goes on. But no one in first class could pretend that they hadn't just witnessed something very important. Danielle closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to keep myself from being swept away by emotions. She knew this wasn't the end. This is just the first moment. The consequences are beginning to become apparent. And at that altitude of over 30,000 feet, Howard Blake began to understand that power doesn't disappear in a flash. It dissolved in the silence of those who were no longer afraid. The lights in the first-class cabin dimmed. The announcement of preparation for landing sounded steady and calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Those familiar words had never sounded so harsh. Danielle Carter opened her eyes. She wasn't asleep. She was just letting her body slow down enough to keep her mind alert. Beside him, Howard Blake sat still. His hands rested on his lap. No more tapping his feet. No more shaking his legs. A silence quite different from the silence before. It's not stress, it's helplessness. Howard knew. From this moment on, things would no longer be in his hands. The airplane cabin was preparing to descend. The change in pressure caused my ears to feel slightly heavy, but the heaviest sensation didn't come from my body. It comes from perception. Emily Harris walked down the aisle checking the seat belts. When she reached row 2, she paused for a moment. Are you all right, Emily? Asked Danielle in a very low voice. Danielle nodded. Okay, thank you. Emily looked at Howard. Then she looked at Danielle. She said nothing more. But her eyes had changed. No more avoidance. No more fear. That's the look in someone's eyes, someone who's just realized they have the right to be respected. Howard sensed that. He leaned towards Danielle, his voice lowered. Do you think this is the end of it? He asked. Do you think I'll let you off the hook after this? Danielle looked at him. No, she replied. I think he'll do what he always does. Howard smirked. And what is that? He asked. Danielle didn't answer immediately. He'll try to control the narrative, she said slowly. He'll make phone calls, send emails, meet with the right people. Howard chuckled softly. So you understand me, he said. Danielle nodded. I understand you, she said, because I've worked with many people like you. Howard tilted his head. And they won, he said. Danielle looked straight at him. Not all, she replied. Howard remained silent. The aircraft's wheels touched the runway, a decisive touch. Then a prolonged scraping sound. The airplane cabin shook slightly, then it gradually stabilized. Some passengers breathed a sigh of relief as if they had just completed a longer than usual journey. But for Howard Blake, this was just the beginning. The plane taxied into the gate. Normally by this time, people like Howard would have already gotten up, grabbed their luggage, get ready to rush out of the cabin. He remained seated today. Captain Michael Reynolds appeared in the hallway once again. His voice rang out clearly. Please remain seated. We need to complete a short procedure before opening. The first-class cabin held its breath. Howard turned sharply to Danielle. What did you do? He asked. Danielle looked straight ahead. There's nothing to do but tell the truth, she replied. Howard clenched his fists. You have no right to detain me, he said. Danielle turned to look at him. I'm not holding him back, she said. The system is doing its job. Howard chuckled sarcastically. The system, he repeated. The system has always been on my side. Danielle nodded. In the past, she said. The airplane cabin was eerily silent. Footsteps echoed from outside the compartment door. Clearly, definitely. 2 airport security officers appeared. They were followed by a man in a gray suit carrying a document clip. Howard jumped to his feet. What the hell is going on? He shouted. The man in the gray suit looked at the name tag. Mr. Howard Blake, he asked. Yes, Howard replied, and I demand an immediate explanation. The man nodded. I am Daniel Moore, representing the legal department of Aurora Air Group, he said. We need to speak with you about an incident that occurred on this flight. Howard Quay sang Danielle. She called them, he said. Danielle shook her head. No, she replied. I just didn't stop them from working. Daniel Moore looked at Danielle. He nodded slightly respectfully. Miss Carter, he said, everything is ready. Howard watched the scene, his eyes wide with surprise. Wait, he said. You can't. Daniel Moore raised his hand. Mr. Blake, he said calmly, this is not an arrest, but we need your cooperation. Howard laughed loudly. Cooperation, he said. What are you doing? Daniel Moore looked directly at him. During the flight, he said there were reports of disruptive behavior, verbal harassment, and creating an unsafe environment for passengers and crew. Howard Quay sang Danielle. You're ruining my reputation, he said. Danielle looked at him. He did it himself, she replied. Daniel Moore continued. According to Aurora Air Group policy, he said, we need you to disembark with us to complete the paperwork. Howard shook his head. No, he said. I'm not going anywhere. 2 security guards stepped forward. Don't touch him, but get close enough so he can't be ignored. The airplane cabin was silent. Howard looked around. He looked at the people who had avoided his gaze, the people who had been silent. No one was looking at him at that moment. Finally, he bent down and picked up his briefcase. You think you've won, he whispered to Danielle as he walked past, but you'll pay the price. Danielle watched him go. Maybe, she said, but that's a price I've been willing to pay for a long time. Howard Blake stepped out of the first-class cabin. No applause, no cheers. He was simply a man who left when power no longer protected him. Daniel Moore turned to look at Danielle. We will update you soon, he said. Danielle nodded. Thank you, she replied. Emily Harris stood at the back of the compartment. She looked at Danielle, her eyes red and swollen. Thank you, Emily said. Her voice trembled slightly. Danielle smiled. Thank you for doing your job properly, she said. The airplane cabin doors slowly opened. Passengers began to stand up. Everything seemed normal. But Danielle knew, and everyone else in this compartment knew. They have just witnessed something very rare. There was a moment when power didn't come from speaking the loudest, but from standing still when necessary. Danielle retrieved her luggage and walked out into the hallway. Before leaving the compartment, she turned around to look back. Seat 2B is empty. And for the first time during the entire flight, Danielle allowed herself to breathe out slowly. The corridors at San Francisco International Airport are wide and well lit. The white lights reflected off the polished stone floor, making every step sound clearer than usual. People were pulling suitcases, talking and laughing, hurrying along. Life goes on, it always has. But for Howard Blake, the world had just entered a different orbit. He walked out of the arrival area between 2 security guards. He wasn't handcuffed. He wasn't pushed around. It's just that, I can't go alone anymore. Howard held his head high, as was his habit, but then the eyes started to appear. It wasn't just a curious look, it was a look of recognition. A young man stopped, glanced at Howard, and subtly frowned. A woman whispered something to her friend holding a phone in her hand. Howard knows this feeling. The feeling of becoming the subject of conversation, but not in the way he was familiar with. This won't go any further, Howard said, trying to keep his voice calm. You're overreacting. Daniel Moore walked beside him without turning around. Maybe, Daniel replied. But maybe not. Howard paused. What do you mean? He asked. Daniel stopped, turned, and looked at Howard. I mean, Daniel said slowly, when a story is no longer in the hands of the storyteller, it travels very far. Howard squinted. He said, thinks she's just started a small revolution. Daniel didn't object. No, he said, she just lets things be seen. Howard chuckled softly. Did you see it? He said. Do you think the world cares what happens in a first-class cabin? Daniel looked at him. "The world doesn't care," he said, "but the internet does." Howard remained silent. Meanwhile, in another area of the airport, Danielle Carter stood near a large window overlooking the runway. The plane, having just landed, remained there like a silent witness. Danielle wasn't in a hurry to leave. She was waiting. Don't wait for the results. Wait for the after effects. She knew that situations like this didn't end with a dialogue. They ended with a chain reaction. Emily Harris approached. "Miss Carter," Emily said, her voice still slightly shaky. "The HR department just called me." Danielle Quay sang. "What did they say?" she asked. Emily swallowed. "They said they wanted my report to be taken into account in its entirety. No editing. No abridging." Danielle nodded. "That's what should happen," she said. Emily was silent for a moment. "I've seen things like this before," Emily whispered, "but they always went unnoticed." Danielle looked at her. "It's not because they don't matter," Danielle said. "It's because no one is taking responsibility for looking them in the eye." Emily took a deep breath. "Thank you," she said, "for not leaving." Danielle smiled very slightly. "Thank you," she replied, "for standing firm." At the other end of the airport, Howard Blake sat in a makeshift office. No windows, no paintings, just a table, a few chairs, and a cold fluorescent light. His phone rang. One message, then another, and then another. Howard turned on the computer. "Are you okay? What's going on?" "There's a video circulating." Howard frowned. "Video?" he muttered. He opened his browser. Social media appeared. A short clip. The camera angle isn't perfect. The sound is a bit distorted. But it's clear enough. It was his voice. Even he recognized it. "She doesn't belong here." Howard clutched the phone tightly. "No," he whispered. "That's impossible. The video isn't long. But it doesn't need to be long. It just needs to be enough for people to understand." Howard scrolled down. Thousands of comments, hundreds of thousands of views. His name began appearing alongside words he never imagined would be associated with him. Howard threw the phone down on the table. "This will pass," he said loudly, as if the whole room needed to hear. "I've been through worse things than this." The phone vibrated again. A phone call. The name displayed is board assistant. Howard hesitated for a second. Then he picked up the phone. "Hello," he said. The voice on the other end was straightforward. "Howard," the man said, "the board is requesting an emergency meeting." Howard chuckled softly. "Of course," he said. "It was just a small misunderstanding." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "They've seen the video," the person said, "and they're not calling it a misunderstanding." Howard jumped to his feet. "You can't, Howard," the voice interrupted. "Come to the office as soon as possible." The call has ended. Howard stood there, alone. For the first time in many years, he didn't know who to call next. At that same moment, in a glass building in downtown San Francisco, Danielle Carter walked into a meeting room. No fanfare, no welcoming ceremony. It was just a group of people waiting for her. Daniel Moore stood up. "We have received confirmation," he said. "The report has been sent to the entire executive board." Danielle nodded. "Any feedback?" she asked. Daniel inhaled. "There are many," he said, "and not all of them are easy to listen to." Danielle smiled slightly. "Pleasant feedback usually doesn't change anything," she said. A woman in the room spoke up. "Miss Carter," she said, "we're going to face a lot of pressure. From the media, from our partners." Danielle looked at her. "I know," she said, "but pressure is no excuse for silence." She paused for a moment. "It's a reason to do it right." The afternoon passed. News spread quickly. It's not just videos. Other stories are starting to emerge. Those who had met Howard Blake, those who had remained silent, those who had thought that speaking out wouldn't change anything. They started speaking up. Howard sat in the car, watching the city flash by through the window. San Francisco is still beautiful, but he no longer sees it the same way as before. The phone vibrates. This time it was a short message. We need to talk. Right now. Howard closed his eyes. He thought about the airplane cabin, about the woman who hadn't left her seat. For the first time, a very unpleasant thought arose. Perhaps she was right. But that thought was quickly dismissed. Howard opened his eyes. "Not yet," he said softly. "It's not over yet." Meanwhile, Danielle stood by the office window watching the city lights come on. She knew things were going in the right direction. It's not easy, it's not gentle, but that's true. And somewhere in this city, a man is gradually coming to understand that. Once the airport doors close, the outside world won't wait for him to adapt. Evenings in San Francisco fall very quickly. The glass buildings reflect the city lights like vertical shards of mirror. A breeze blows from the bay, carrying the distinctive coolness of the West. Howard Blake sat in the black sedan, his hands on his lap, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The driver said nothing. The atmosphere in the car was heavy, as if someone had just slammed all the windows shut. "Come to the office," Howard said curtly. The car started moving. Howard told himself that everything was still under control. He had faced crises before. He had been scrutinized by the press. He had been pressured by partners. Things like that will eventually pass. But deep down, another part of Howard knew very well. This time, it wasn't like the previous times. The top-floor meeting room at Howard's company was brightly lit. The board of directors was present in full. No one stood up when Howard walked in. No one exchanged pleasantries. Just serious faces and a large screen showing the video from the airplane cabin. Howard stopped. "No need to review," he said. "I know you've seen enough already." The chairman of the council, a man with gray hair, spoke up. "Howard," he said slowly, "we don't care what you said in the heat of the moment." Howard raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's fine," he said, "because it's a personal matter." The man shook his head. "No," he said. "It's no longer a personal matter." He pointed at the screen. "You are the face of this company," he said. "And that behavior is having direct consequences." Howard inhaled. "What are the consequences?" he asked. Another person spoke up. "3 major partners have requested clarification on our perspective regarding corporate culture." Another person. "An investment fund is reconsidering its investment." Howard chuckled softly. "Just because of one video?" he asked. "Are you going to let social media control the company?" The chairman of the board looked directly at Howard. "No," he said. "We intend to let trust guide the company." The room fell silent. Howard felt his throat dry up. "What do you want?" he asked. The chairman of the council closed the file in front of him. "We want you to temporarily step down from your executive role," he said. "Effective immediately." Howard stood frozen. "You can't do that," he said. "I built this company." The chairman of the council nodded. "That's right," he said. "And that's precisely why we need to protect it. And from you." Howard clenched his fists. "This is a political game," he said. "And Howard," the board chairman interrupted. "Don't turn this into a personal fight." Howard remained silent. For the first time, he felt his power no longer made the room tilt. Meanwhile, in another building in the city, Danielle Carter sat alone in her office. The desk lamp was switched on. Outside, the city lit up like a river of light. Danielle looked at the computer screen. A long list was in front of her. The names, the reports, the internal notes. She didn't celebrate. She didn't breathe a sigh of relief either. She knew. When a system begins to change, the hardest decisions aren't made with the person who caused the problem, but it's for those who stay behind. Daniel Moore knocked on the door, then went inside. "Miss Carter," he said, "we have received confirmation from the other board of directors." Danielle looked up. "Howard Blake?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "He has been asked to step down from his executive role," he said. "Temporarily." Danielle didn't react immediately. "And what about his team?" she asked. Daniel breathed softly. "That's the complicated part," he said. "Many of them weren't directly involved, but they've been silent." Danielle leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes for a few seconds. She thought about the airplane cabin, about Emily Harris, about the eyes of those who had chosen to say nothing. Danielle understood that silence. She had been silent like that before. "We're not going to do a witch hunt," Danielle said. "But we can't pretend nothing happened either." Daniel nodded. "How do you want to do it?" he asked. Danielle opened her eyes. "We begin with the truth," she said. "And responsibility." The following morning an internal memo was sent out. Not long, not overly dramatic, just clear text. Aurora Air Group is committed to building a respectful, safe environment that is tolerant of discrimination. All reports will be reviewed independently. No exceptions. Danielle read the announcement several times. She knew there would be objections. There would be people saying she was going too far. There would be people thinking she was just showing off. But there will also be those who feel heard for the first time. In another corner of the city, Howard Blake sat in his apartment. The apartment was spacious, expensive, but cold. He looked at the empty desk, where the company phone used to be, the access card, things that once confirmed his place in this world. My personal phone rang. A message from someone who used to be very close. "For now, let's not contact each other. The situation is sensitive." Howard put the phone down. For the first time he felt something very specific: loss. It's not an abstract concept. It's not a risk on paper. It's the feeling when a familiar door no longer opens. That afternoon, Danielle met Emily Harris at a cafe near the headquarters. Not a meeting, just a conversation. Emily sat opposite, holding a cup of coffee in both hands. "I'm still not used to it," Emily said softly. "People are starting to talk more." Danielle smiled. "That can be scary," she said. "But it's also a sign of change." Emily nodded. "I'm scared," she confessed. "What if everything goes back to how it was?" Danielle looked at her. "Maybe," she said. "There's no guarantee." Emily looked down. "So why do you still do it?" Emily asked. Danielle thought for a moment. "Because if nobody does anything," she said, "then everything will surely go back to how it was before." Emily inhaled, then exhaled very slowly. "I understand," she said. In the evening, Danielle stood by the office window. The city down below is still noisy, still moving. Danielle knew she had just set a precedent. Not perfect, not completely safe, but it's necessary. Somewhere in the city, Howard Blake is learning to live with the fact that he's no longer the center of the room. And elsewhere, people like Emily Harris are learning to believe that silence is no longer the only option. The story isn't over yet, but one chapter has come to an end, and the next chapter won't be easy for anyone. The night in San Francisco was quieter than Danielle Carter had imagined. This city never sleeps. But tonight, from the high-rise office where Danielle stands, everything seems to slow down. Lights from the buildings opposite shone through the windows, casting long, thin rectangles on the floor. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains. Danielle stood there for a long time, not holding her phone, not reading a report, just stand. Her body was tired. Not the kind of tiredness from work, but the kind of tiredness from having to constantly stand firm. In the past 3 days, she has made more decisions than in the previous 3 months combined. Decisions about people, about culture, about things that no spreadsheet can measure. Danielle closed her eyes. In her mind, the image of the first-class cabin was vivid. Seat 2A, the yellow lights, Howard Blake's voice. The silence of the people around her. She remembers the moment she stood up, the moment she said no, not because it's dramatic, but because it can't be relived. Danielle wondered, what if I had stood up at that moment just to protect myself? But I went further. I brought an entire system into the light. She opened her eyes. Outside, a police car siren blared in the distance. The sound was brief and then faded into the night. Danielle suddenly realized that this was the first time in a long time she had allowed herself to doubt herself. The phone vibrates. Danielle looked down at the screen. "Mom." She hesitated for a second. Then she answered the phone. "It's me," Danielle said. The woman's voice on the other end was warm and slow. "Mom just wanted to ask. Are you okay?" Danielle smiled, even though her mother couldn't see it. "I'm fine," she replied habitually. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "You don't need to be so strong with me," her mother said. "I've seen the news." Danielle exhaled very slowly. "I know," she said. "Then tell me," she continued. "Are you wondering if it's worth it?" Danielle paused. She didn't expect her mother to ask so directly. "Yes," she admitted. Her mother didn't answer immediately. "Danielle," she said after a moment, "do you remember the first time you asked me why things were harder for us?" Danielle remembers. She remembered herself as a child standing in the kitchen, school bag in hand, wondering why she always had to try twice as hard. "I remember," she continued. "I told you that it wasn't for you to prove you deserved it." Danielle closed her eyes. "Let me lead the way," her mother said. Tears welled up in Danielle's eyes. It didn't fall, but it was enough to make her throat tighten. "I didn't say you have to carry the weight of the world," she continued. "But I know there are paths that can only be opened by those who dare to stand still." Danielle was speechless for a few seconds. "I'm tired," she said softly. "I know," she replied. "The pioneers always get tired. The call has ended." Danielle put the phone down on the table. She stood still for a moment longer, then she returned to her desk. The next morning, Danielle arrived at the meeting room earlier than usual. No press, no cameras, only members of the executive board are allowed. Some faces were tense. Some eyes avoided eye contact. Danielle looked at each person. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to say one thing." The room was silent. "These past few days," Danielle said slowly, "haven't been easy for any of us." A man sitting near the end of the table spoke up. "We are under a lot of pressure," he said, "from partners, from the media, from shareholders." Danielle nodded. "I know," she said, "and I don't deny it." Another person continued. "Some people think we're moving too fast." Danielle looked at the person. "Maybe," she said, "but I want to ask a question." She stopped. "If we don't hurry now," she said, "when will we?" No one answered immediately. Danielle continued. "I'm not asking for absolute consent," she said. "I'm asking for honesty." She looked around. "If anyone in this room believes that what happened on that flight should be overlooked to keep the peace, I want that person to speak up." The silence dragged on, not heavy, just bare. Finally, a woman spoke up. "I used to be silent," she said. "Not because I agreed, but because I was afraid." Danielle nodded. "Thank you," she said. Another person chimed in. "I worry that we'll lose even more if we continue," he said. "But I also know that if we stop, we'll lose ourselves." Danielle smiled softly. "That's the question," she said. "What do we want to keep?" The meeting lasted a long time. Not harsh, not dramatic, but every word was heavy. That afternoon, Danielle received an email. No long headlines, just one line. "She made me think. Sender Emily Harris." Danielle read it over and over again. "It's not about the content. It's about the feeling," she answered briefly. "Thank you for telling me." Danielle knew that the real change didn't come from internal announcements. It came from emails, like this one. That evening, Danielle returned to her apartment. "Don't turn on the main lights. Just use the table lamp." She changed her clothes, made a cup of hot tea, and then sat down on the sofa. Her body gradually relaxed. For the first time in days, Danielle allowed herself to do nothing at all. No strategy, no plan, just a human being. She thought about Howard Blake, not with anger, but with a very simple question. What made him the person he is? Danielle didn't have an answer. And she realized she didn't need to have it. Her job wasn't to fix people. It was to fix the systems that allowed that behavior to exist. Danielle set her teacup down. She looked at her watch. "It's late. Tomorrow will be the start of something new, and it won't be any easier than today." But at this moment in this quiet room, Danielle knew one thing for sure. Despite being tired, despite being suspected, despite having to pay the price, she has no regrets for standing firm. Because changes only happen when someone dares to stop in the midst of the familiar flow and say, "No, that's enough." It was a foggy morning in San Francisco. The tall buildings were shrouded in a thin layer of mist, as if the city were trying to conceal what had happened during the night. Traffic was still heavy. The cafes were still open. The world doesn't stop because one person falls apart. But for Howard Blake, this morning was unlike any morning he had ever known. He sat alone in the large apartment, the long dining table never having been used properly. The coffee has gone cold. The phone is silent. No more barrage of calls. No more assistants reminding you of appointments. No more feeling needed. Howard looked at the television screen. The news is playing. This isn't about him. Not directly. But he knew. He was there amidst the nameless words. Following the controversial incident on the Aurora Air Group flight, many companies began reviewing their internal culture. Howard turned off the TV. He stood up and walked to the window. From above, the city appears smaller. For the first time in his life, Howard Blake felt like he was no longer on top. At the same time, at Aurora Air Group headquarters, Danielle Carter was attending a closed-door meeting. Not a strategy meeting, not a media meeting, but it was a meeting about people. Daniel Moore opened the file. "We have completed our review," he said. "Howard Blake has been officially removed from all positions associated with Aurora Air Group." Danielle nodded. "What about the next clause?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "There's a proposal," he said. "From the advisory council." Danielle looked at him. "What did they propose?" she asked. Daniel inhaled. "They suggested making a stronger statement, more personal, calling him by his name, putting an end to it completely." The room was silent. Danielle leaned back in her chair. She had anticipated this. "And what do you think?" she asked Daniel. Daniel thought for a moment. "Legally," he said, "we can do it, and it will be supported." Danielle nodded. "And what about the human aspect?" she asked. Danielle didn't answer immediately. "From a human perspective," he said after a moment, "it will leave him with no way back." Danielle looked down at the table. She recalled the moment Howard Blake sat silently on the plane. No more arrogance, no more shouting. Just a man, stripped of the role he always used to conceal his true self. Danielle looked up. "We won't do that," she said. Daniel was surprised. "Are you sure?" he asked. "It will help us close the story." Danielle shook her head. "No," she said. "It only provides temporary emotional satisfaction." She stopped. "I didn't build Aurora to crush people," she said. "I built it to change the way people treat each other." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. That afternoon, Howard Blake received an email. Not long, not sensational. "Sender Aurora Air Group, Office of the CEO." Howard read. Then read it again. There were no accusations, no harsh words. It was just an official announcement, and the last paragraph made him pause for a long time. Aurora Air Group believes that responsibility comes with the opportunity for change. "We will not be continuing our partnership, but we are not seeking to destroy the individual either. The path forward is his choice." Howard let go of her hand. Email doesn't fall. It sits there like an unlocked door. Howard laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was a dry, hollow laugh. He muttered, "she still chooses to stand taller." Howard sat down in the chair. For the first time in years, he didn't know who he was when he no longer held a title. No more nameplates, no more meeting rooms. Only one stark question remains. What kind of person have I become? That evening, Danielle Carter attended an internal briefing. No large stage, no bright lights. It was just a small room, and the staff sat in a circle. Danielle didn't stand. She sat with them. "I'm not here to tell a victory story," she said. "I'm here to talk about responsibility." Everyone listened in silence. "What happened on that flight," Danielle said, "is not uncommon." She looked around. "It's only rare because this time, we didn't turn away." One person raised their hand. "Do you regret it?" the man asked. "For pushing things this far," Danielle thought for a second. "There are nights," she said, "when I wonder if I've hurt anyone." The room fell silent. "I don't, Mordango," and contacted it into deceit. "But I also wonder," she continued, "if I remain silent, how many other people will I hurt?" Nobody said anything. Danielle smiled slightly. "Leadership isn't about always being right," she said. "It's about taking responsibility for the choices you make." A few days later, Howard Blake appeared in an unexpected place. A small career counseling center. No fancy signage, no receptionists in suits. Howard was standing in line. No one recognized him. Or if they did, they didn't care. Then it was his turn and he entered the room. A middle-aged man sat opposite. "What do you need our help with?" the man asked. Howard was silent for a few seconds. He said, his voice sounding strange. "I don't know what I'll do next." The other person nodded. "So that's a starting point," he said. Howard sat there. No more leather chairs, no more large wooden tables. Just a human being, learning to look back at themselves. Danielle Carter stood by the office window gazing at the city at night. She knew this story was about to end, not with applause, not with schadenfreude, but with a long silence. She knew some people would be disappointed that she didn't completely win over Howard Blake, but she also knew that defeating a person was never a true victory. Danielle turned off the lights. Tomorrow she will resume her work, not as a hero, but as someone who chose not to turn away. And sometimes that's the hardest thing. If you followed this story this far, you can probably sense it too. This is not a story about victory, nor is it a story about revenge. Rather, it's a story about very small moments when people are faced with a choice and choose something different. 3 months after that flight, San Francisco entered autumn. The air is cooler. The trees are beginning to change color. The city seemed to calm down as if it too were learning to breathe more slowly. Danielle Carter stepped out of the elevator and walked down the familiar hallway of Aurora Air Group headquarters. Everything looks the same. But in reality, things have changed. Meetings no longer begin with tense silence. Reports are no longer dismissed as untimely. And whispered words are no longer swallowed. Danielle stopped in front of a glass wall. Inside there was an internal training session. No famous speakers, no fancy slides. They're just people sitting together learning to listen. Danielle stood there for a while. She didn't go in. She doesn't need to be in every frame. She knows that once the system starts working properly, the best leaders are those who can step back. Elsewhere in the city, in a much older building, Howard Blake sat in a small classroom. No electronic whiteboard, no large meeting table. There was just a circle of plastic chairs and a whiteboard. Howard held the pen in his hand. These hands have signed multi-million-dollar contracts. They have tapped the table to give orders. They have silenced others. Now it trembles slightly. "Could you share?" the instructor said calmly. "The last time you realized you had hurt someone." Howard looked down at the floor. There is no immediate answer. The room was quiet. Finally he spoke up. "On a flight," he said. "And not just one person." No one interrupted. No one judged. Howard took a deep breath. "I thought I was strong," he said, "but I used my power to mask my weakness." That sentence fell into the room like a small stone. Not loudly, but enough to create a ripple. Howard didn't know if he would be forgiven. He wasn't even sure he deserved it. But for the first time, he is taking responsibility. Another afternoon, Emily Harris stood in the cabin of a first-class airplane. She adjusted her scarf, checked the passenger list. Everything looks familiar. But Emily felt differently. She no longer bows her head when someone raises their voice. She no longer swallows her apologies when she's not in the wrong. When a passenger complained without reason, Emily smiled, her voice steady. "Sir," she said, "we are willing to help, but please maintain respect." The man was surprised. Then he fell silent. Emily turned away. Her heart was pounding, but she was no longer afraid. She remembered Danielle Carter, not because of her power, but because of the way she stood still. Danielle received an email. No fancy title. Sender Howard Blake. She read slowly. No excuses. No blame. Just a few short lines. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to say, I'm starting to understand, and I'm sorry." Danielle didn't answer immediately. She put the phone down. She looked out the window. She neither smiled nor frowned, just a long, gentle sigh. She didn't know what Howard Blake's future held, and she didn't need to know. She understood that true change doesn't always require a clear-cut ending. A few weeks later, Danielle stood on the small stage of an internal conference. No bright lights, no loud applause. She looked down at the audience. We often think Danielle said that big moments will change the world. She stopped. But actually, she continued. The world changes in very small moments. She described the flight. No details, no drama, just enough for people to understand. "I didn't stand up because I'm the CEO," she said. "I stood up because I'm a human being." The auditorium was silent. "And I believe," she continued, "any one of us can do it." This story doesn't end with anyone being ruined. It ended with some people starting to look back at themselves. Danielle Carter didn't become a hero. Howard Blake didn't become a complete villain. Emily Harris didn't become an icon. They are just people who have gone through a moment and haven't emerged the same way. And perhaps that's what's most memorable. If you've ever remained silent when you should have spoken, if you've ever feared losing your position, if you've ever wondered, should I stand up, this story doesn't provide the answer for you. It only reminds you of one thing: you never know whether you stand still or stand up. It will change someone's life. If you find this story relatable, please hit like to support the channel. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. And if you'd like, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were Danielle? And how would you change if you were Howard? Thank you for staying until the very end. See you in the next story.